Hello, Internet. This is Daniel with Driving Dragons, and the witching hour draws near as the eve of All Hallows falls upon the gaming world, and that means, of course, just two things. First, Catholics having to educate both other Christians who fail to understand its Christian origins, as well as hostile non-Christians who mistakenly believe that it was created to overshadow the Celtic holiday of Samhain, despite the adaptation of rituals and trappings similar to the holiday being only a recent occurrence in the last few centuries. And of course, the topic of this particular editorial, horror-themed sessions around the tabletop role-playing game table. And perhaps the most impactful and genre-defining adventure module of all time, 1983's Ravenloft, began its existence as author Tracy Hickman's annual Halloween game in 1978. And this was preceded by modules such as House on Hangman's Hill in 81 and the massive 240-room haunted house Tegel Manor from 77, proving that themes of dread and horror on the holiday favored by ghouls and ghasts stretch back nearly to the inception of TTRPGs. However, the question remains, why, with such a perfect example of how to do it correctly as Ravenloft, can't game masters, and more specifically dungeon masters, seem to pull it off? Well, let's talk about something even more horrifying. The distributor for the 280ZX is still not here. It haunts my dreams. It should be here in the next several days as of the recording of this video. And with that, I can actually get some more good car repair footage as those parts come in, and getting the engine running is first on the list of things to do. So we're going to have some driving footage and a few other things, but it really does kind of wound me to my soul that that distributor is not here yet. On the plus side, I did manage to actually get the stripped screws out so I could get my engine control module off of the distributor so that I don't have to buy one of those. But anyway, horror-themed games. Now, the OGGM got a short video out, which I will link here, about spookiness and whatnot. I haven't had a chance to watch it yet, but I saw it pop up in my notifications, and I will link it here. And of course, Seth Skorkowski and numerous others have had videos every year about horror, and I even have my own, which I will also link here, that I did last year for Halloween. It's all out there. It's the talk of the town in the month of October. I have even written an article that will be in the next issue of the Elven Maid Inn's Tales from the Tavern, which should come out in the next few weeks. I have a full write-up on it, and it's actually content from that article that I'm going to be discussing in this video right here, and just some rules for writing Halloween horror. So the big thing about horror is above all a mood game, and you can use a couple of, we'll call them cheap tricks, to make things easier, but I do tend to avoid those cheap tricks. Like, for instance, switching systems. Even though my personal group will actually be running a Call of Cthulhu one-shot for Halloween this year, you shouldn't necessarily need to switch systems to a Delta Green or to a Call of Cthulhu or to some other horror-themed game in order to elicit the emotion and the response that you want from your players. It should really be in how you run the game, a lot less about what system you use. However, changing the system can help, because one of the biggest things you have to have in a horror-themed game is player buy-in. If the players are not going to buy into the roleplay, if the players are not going to buy into the fact that they are showing up to be frightened, showing up to be uncomfortable, showing up to be vulnerable, they're not going to experience the game the way you want it to. You have to have buy-in. This is not the situation where playing on cell phones, goofing off, quoting movies, and worrying about who's ordering the pizza and stuff can happen. That is a thing that just is antithetical to horror. I was actually asked if I was going to do a horror theme episode this year by one of our viewers, because he was looking at my chart on prep level in different styles of play, and he's like, well, you see that I said that horror really can't be more than a 1 or 2 session thing, and why is that, and wanted to hear about it. And I probably will do a video specifically about that later. But the long and short of it is that horror relies on built suspense and pent-up anxiety. And unless you're talking about like cheap jump scares and stuff. And while carrying over suspense with cliffhangers and stuff can work a little bit, there's two things that work against you. One is structuring a session to where it ends on that cliffhanger and the cliffhanger doesn't feel forced. And the second thing is the unavoidable truth that we don't typically play these games every night or a few hours apart. Sometimes we don't even play them every week. And if your group is meeting once every 14 days or once every 3 weeks or once a month, the idea of them carrying that anxiety and suspense from one session all the way to the next with real life and soccer games and kids going to school and prom for their daughter and the fishing tournament and that car show they're going to go to with their buddies and that big work event, the game and the thread of that narrative is going to be lost over that time. And that just is antithetical to horror. It hurts your horror because when you sit back down, even if you had your cliffhanger and everything, now you're having to go back over and re-explain all the stuff that happened last session that got them frightened and anxious in the first place, and that paraphrased version with the little piece here and the correction over there from the thing that was slightly misremembered is just going to hurt it. It can be done over a couple of sessions. I've done it myself. Really great game masters can carry a thread for a certain amount of time, but realistically, unless you are somebody who has a group that is playing like every week and has that real deep buy-in, it's just very, very difficult to carry the suspense and anxiety from session to session. So even though that's almost a little mini video about it right there, let's go ahead and move on to some of these rules. The first one is to avoid transgression. First thing that horror-themed DMs that have to kind of stay away from is what the pro wrestling world refers to as cheap heat. Okay, cheap heat is something that gets out there and just immediately makes everybody angry or gets an easy response, like a knee-jerk reaction. But it's not really clever or anything. It's there because it is just so in your face. So being transgressive can be immersion breaking, which, as I said, is critical to horror. And because the emotional response from it is really more to the game master themselves because they chose to do something that was really going to be offensive to the player rather than to the character. They're not anxious as their character. They're simply offended by what the game master did. And the other problem is that it evokes the wrong kind of emotion. There's different emotional spectrums out there in the world. And when it comes to horror, you want to get people on the fear spectrum, on the anxiety spectrum, not on the anger section. That's not where you want it to be. Okay? You want to be in a state of disgust. You want dislike and aversion. You want it to be repugnant as opposed to frustrated, argumentative, furious. You don't want these particular kinds of views. It's the wrong thing. That shock value is cheap, but it doesn't really give you what you want. You want sweaty palms. You want them to feel uneasy. But what you don't want them to do is to be so ticked off they got to go for a drive because they just don't want to see you because you gave a really detailed description that is religiously offensive to somebody. Like, for instance, you have for instance, you have a Muslim in your group. You have somebody who's of the Islamic faith, and you decide to include some great blasphemy against Allah, or you decide to have a nun do something that is untoward because you want to piss off the Catholic or the Christian who's at the table. And this is just a shock value that is being exploited by the game master as opposed to something that is truly building anxiety or suspense. And it just kind of comes down to this, and I'm going to use a direct quote from the article I wrote, which is, if you know a player was beaten with a heavy leather belt by his alcoholic father as a child, Having a drunken villain capture that player's character and beat him with a whip in order to trigger a response is not good horror. It's just being a dick. That is it. Transgression is something that has to be carefully done. Horror does have some transgression that has to be there, but for the sake of this conversation, when I say don't be transgression or avoid transgression, what I'm saying is you want to avoid things that are designed to attack the player through their character, as opposed to something that's designed to pull the player into their character and make them feel that anxiety on behalf of the character. So that's a very clear distinction, and it can be difficult to do. And if you're not somebody who's very conscious and very careful of it and playing with people you really know and you understand, don't use transgression. Next one's going to be a real hard one for me, which is keep it brief. Why keep it brief? Because the long and short of it is you kind of, like I said before, it's kind of hard to carry tension and immersion throughout several sessions. And especially if you want something that they really dread, you want that deep feeling of anxiety, it requires buy-in and emotion, which is going to, there's a couple of problems with it. One is it's extremely taxing. It takes a lot of energy on behalf of the player themselves to carry that emotional burden from session to session. Think about it. If you've ever been in a situation that you were really anxious, something you were truly scared of, something that was really frightening, or something that really had that strong emotional tension on you as a person, and you're just covered in sweat and completely worn out, and you sleep for 12 hours that night for something that took an hour, because of the sheer level of adrenaline and drain. People can't keep that up, and they're not going to keep that up. And if somehow you manage to evoke that through a game, you've probably actually damaged that person if that happens. So when in doubt, write less. A game can always be slowed down to make things linger and to make things stew and build. But it's really difficult to really maintain tension and keep things going if you're trying to take something that was written or designed or thought out that it's going to be like 5 or 6 sessions and trying to cram it down into 1 or 2. That is a situation where you're going to lose effect because that multi-session structure does not lend itself well to being compressed as much as a shorter session being stretched out is. Next thing, playing off of that, pacing is everything. Dread is a function of anxiety, and anxiety is a product of time and stress. Boiled down to its roots, fear comes from not knowing, the uncertainty, being able to kind of craft mental illusions that are more terrifying than the last thing that happened. So, as a game master, you have to balance it between a fast enough progression to where you maintain interest and you avoid people getting bored and distracted or end up running into the dreaded, there's like 15 minutes left and we all had to quit and go home because we're all worn out and now we got a 15-minute session to finish this game. But at the same time, keeping things slow enough to allow those things to build up. Ravenloft did this by giving the players a tremendous amount of freedom to explore all the different set pieces and stuff around the adventure, and giving you a bunch of different avenues for them to reach the conclusion of the adventure, but it also has mechanics like Strahd moving around the castle, and particularly him popping up in situations where they're not going to have a way to beat him, as something that kind of keeps them moving towards that goal. They're on constant pressure to hurry up and find the Sun Sword or whatever else they're going to use to defeat the Count. There's an expression we have down here in the South: you can't push a man with a rope. This is never been more true than it is in horror. You can't force the players moving forward. The thing about horror is you absolutely cannot have a railroad. You need a linear storyline, but you have to have a situation where you are slowly guiding the players towards something and getting a little faster and a little more as they come forward, making the world smaller and smaller and dragging them into the conclusion, but letting them make the decisions on how to get there and having that freedom so that the pressure is what moves them rather than force. Next rule, The game master is never going to write anything that is more frightening than what's in the player's head. It's just not going to happen. Once a game master had the party of 3rd edition Dungeons and Dragons come across a skeletal figure draped in robes, bearing arcane sigils and threateningly gesturing towards them with a staff. Party fled, casting all their best warding and defensive spells, knowing full well that a lich was far beyond their abilities. But it was just a skeleton with a quarterstaff stationed in a room by the real lich. Players didn't know that. They let their own imagination do all the craziness. Kind of like in, not the same exact way, but if you look at the Tomb of Horrors, spoiler alert, there's a part where there's a fake ending where this thing that looks like a lich and he's a crazy mummy thing, and when you beat him with the magic scepter, it causes the whole tomb to fake collapse with an illusion. All of it is based off of not giving the player information. What if you can show the PCs a scratch on a tree, or the shadow of a tail disappearing around a corner, or just the like the fin of the shark. Think about the movie Jaws. You never see the whole shark in the movie Jaws. You don't see him. You see the fin. You see him rise up over the water. You see just part of its nose. You see the flick of its tail. You let the players, in this case, but you let the viewer fill in all the blanks, because no matter what you describe, what they think to fill in the blanks is going to be more horrible than anything else that you can put out there. It's a practice of giving just enough. Number 5, split the party, cut the scene. A big part of an anxiety or an anxious feeling, a big part of that building tension, is a feeling of being isolated, being cut off from everybody else. Think about a little kid who's terrified for no reason. He's in a nice place. Maybe he's in Disney World. It's the happiest place on earth. He's surrounded by the Disney characters he loves, and there's Cinderella, and there's the castle, and there's the fun ride, but he can't find his mother. He's terrified because he's lost mom. That connection is gone. Feeling isolated brings anxiety, and it brings terror, and that is very powerful for a game master. Now, of course, we all know the thing, never split the party, never split the party. Okay, but you can have the party step on a teleport trap that only teleports one person, or only teleports 2 people, and teleports them to different places. Failed saves now have forcibly split the party. You can have a door that slams shut behind somebody when somebody pokes their head through it. Anything you can do to split the party gives you 2 powerful tools. One, the players are instantly feeling anxious because now they're separated. They know that if something comes up, they don't have the power that they had. They don't have all the tools. They're in more danger. And the second thing is, it gives you the ability to switch scenes at the best possible times. Right when something nasty reveals itself. Right when a big bad guy comes in and shuts the door and says, now I have you to myself. That's when you turn around and say, okay, well, now we're going to go back to the party who's outside the haunted house, leaving the player who was separated from the party knowing that he just entered a room with an evil villain and not knowing what's happening. Not knowing what the creature around the corner is, because you cut the scene right as the clawed hand grabs the corner of the wall and starts to pull the thing, the unmentionable horror around the hallway to fight them. They have no idea what it is. And they're going to sit there while you run through a scene with the other players, and they're going to sit there thinking, what is this thing? What's it going to be? Where's the problem? How is it? Meanwhile, the rest of the party is sitting here, holy crap, we got to move. We got to get down there. We got to find this thing. If we can find it in 4 or 5 rounds where he went to, find some way to get to him, maybe we can run in before he's killed by whatever this monster is. By using that ability to hop scenes at points right when tension peaks, you leave another player sitting over there at peak tension, letting it eat him alive until you're ready to go back to what he's doing. And then you can pull the old switcheroo where it's like, oh yeah, that wasn't a skeleton, that wasn't a lich, it was a skeleton. It's like, oh man. Or that wasn't an enemy, it's actually an ally. Oh man, oh, there's the relief. Jesus, you almost killed me. Or it can really be something big and nasty, and now they're in a chase, or now they're running away or something. trying to get to where the party is, hoping they hear something, using their metagame knowledge against them because they're hoping that something sounds familiar to what you described to the rest of the party, because maybe that gives them that little bit of hope that they're getting out of it. But splitting the party and cutting the scene is going to help you every time. Number 6, and most important, I'd say, is vulnerability is everything. This is not an exhaustive list. My article is not exhaustive. And there's so much that goes into crafting good horror and good suspense that entire videos, entire channels could probably be made off of it. But vulnerability is absolutely everything you have to have. And this is where system and games does kind of play a bit of a role. Because let's face it, if you're playing Call of Cthulhu, or you're playing Cyberpunk, or you're playing any of these games where the player is going to have 20 hit points and that's all they're ever going to have, and the monster coming around the corner can do 5d6 damage, they know that they're always one hit and one bad roll away from the end. You go to D&D or any of these other more progressive games, and they've always got in the back of their head, they've got these saves, they've got those saves, they got 3 death saves because it's 5th edition, they've got a will save or a fortitude save or a reflex save or something that can give them half damage, and I'm a rogue and I have evasion, so if I can make my save, even if it's half damage, I take no damage. These things, anything that makes the players or the player characters more durable is going to hurt that feeling of vulnerability. So how do we get around it? Well, part of it is by effectively limiting resources and rest and recovery periods and that sort of thing to put more strain and more stress on the characters. Doing things like having an environmental condition that makes it where you're having to waste spell slots or you're having to waste abilities on clearing away fog or being able to see, using things like magical darkness, so they have to waste their waste abilities to make up for the fact that dark vision isn't just a handout to them. You put them in situations where they're on a time limit and they don't have time to take an 8-hour rest or to sleep for the night. So they're only going to get 1 day worth of abilities and spells and whatnot because they're going to run out of time. Do something where there's a horrible storm or it's some kind of crazy lightning and stuff. So ranged weapons don't work as well. So they're having to close into melee against these crazy ghouls that have already been shown in some other way to have the ability to give some kind of leeching, bleeding wound, so they can't stay away from it where they're nice and safe. Giving them threats that will overwhelm them eventually, kind of like Walking Dead or some of the other zombie horror type stuff, survival horror type stuff, where they can kill these zombies and these skeletons and these ghouls hand over fist. They can just sit there and rake through them like they're nothing, chopping through them like they're 1 HP minions. Their minimum damage is going to kill these things, and they have to roll a 1 to not hit. But if you have enough of them, they eventually start soaking up all the resources, and that player always has in the back of their mind that eventually their character is going to face something that they need those abilities for, and those abilities are going to be expended. Eventually they're going to fail if they don't find a way out, and then it becomes a race against time. The last little thing I'm going to give you here, and it's definitely not the least, is kill your characters. Kill them. Kill the characters. Don't save them. Do not give them a rule of cool to get out of a predicament. Don't bend the rules to get them out of tight spots. Do not do certain things that make it easier for them to survive. That's all there is to it. They have to have the knowledge that they can have that character killed. That there isn't a game over, that there is an end. And a lot of times, demonstrating that by having a player character get wiped out by something is the perfect way to do it. You have to have consequences. Otherwise, the horror just doesn't work because the anxiety isn't real, because they always know that there's a safety blanket. This is a situation where you have to play hard-nosed if you really want the effect. So if they die, they die. Anyway, folks, happy Halloween, even though it'll be, 3-4 weeks from now. And be on the lookout for a couple more things about horror and about how suspense doesn't really carry over to different sessions, and maybe even some other examples of some specific game tropes that we can use to help with horror. But I'm hoping this is a good primer for you, and be on the lookout for the Tales from the Tavern from Elven Made Inn sometime here in the next few weeks. See you guys next time.